As we observe Black August, we enter a season of sacred memory. Black August is more than a historical commemoration, it is a liturgy of liberation, a time when we remember the martyrs, the movements, and the uprisings that refuse to let oppression have the last word. It reminds us that memory itself can become a theological act of resistance. Today, I want to bring together three important conversations. First, Michelle Alexander's groundbreaking work, The New Jim Crow. Second, the Attica prison uprising of 1971. And finally, the theological significance of Black August itself. When these three are placed into conversation with one another, they reveal something profound and illuminating about justice, public theology, and the moral responsibility of God conscious Black leadership. Michelle Alexander argues that mass incarceration is not simply a criminal justice issue. It is a racialized system of control. Her central insight is that although the language has changed, many of the structures of exclusion remain remarkably familiar. She demonstrates how criminalization replaces segregation. Surveillance replaces many of the barriers once maintained through Jim Crow. And prisons increasingly become the institutions through which entire communities experience social exclusion. Alexander's argument is not merely sociological, it raises profoundly moral questions. Indeed, I would say that it raises important theological questions. Who is regarded as fully human? Who bears the imago Dei? Who is viewed as dangerous before they have done anything? Who becomes disposable in the public imagination? These are not simply political questions. These are questions about human dignity. They are questions about the image of God. Black August reminds us that systems of control do not simply appear overnight. They emerge from history. They develop over generations. The carceral state did not arise in isolation. They came from somewhere. It came from somewhere. Many have argued that it represents another chapter in the long history of controlling Black bodies, a history stretching from slavery to convict leasing, chain gangs, to Jim Crow, and now to mass incarceration. That brings us to Attica. In September of 1971, and it actually began in, many are arguing that it actually began in August, which brings it into the commemoration of Black August. In that September period, that last of August, September 1971 period, incarcerated men at Attica Correctional Facility rose up. Popular memory often reduces Attica to violence, but the men themselves were making very specific demands. They called for humane living conditions, adequate medical care, religious freedom, educational opportunities, protection from brutality, political rights. These were not extravagant demands. They were fundamentally human demands. They were Christological demands consistent with Jesus's public policy manifesto in Luke 4:18, where he says that I've come to bring good news to the poor, to open prison doors. I've come for the oppressed, and I've come to set the captives free. Attica exposed something that Michelle Alexander will later describe with remarkable clarity. The modern prison system is often far more invested in control than in restoration, far more invested in domination than rehabilitation. And when the state responded with overwhelming force, resulting in the deaths of 39 people, it reveals something deeply troubling about the relationship between power and human dignity. Black August calls us to remember that history honestly. Jesus said, "This do in remembrance of me." We cannot remember Jesus, who was arrested and held captive, crucified and killed, and forget about the injustices such as what occurred in Attica in 1971. We find that Black August calls us to remember not only history, but God's total opposition to the carceral prison for profit state. It reminds us, Black August reminds us that governments sometimes choose force over justice, silence over truth, control over humanity. That is precisely why Attica continues to matter. From a Black August perspective that takes Jesus' words about the prisoner and the oppressed and the poor seriously, remembering Attica is not optional. It is a spiritual discipline. Why? Because memory interrupts the stories societies tell to justify oppression. Memory refuses to accept that prisons are not simply neutral institutions. Memory asks difficult questions. Memory forces us to examine systems in the light of God's justice we have learned to take for granted. Black August remembers Attica alongside figures such as George Jackson, Jonathan Jackson, Assata Shakur, and many others whose names rarely appear in the textbooks, but remain deeply significant within traditions of Black resistance. Their stories remind us that memory itself becomes a form of protest. And I would go even further. Memory becomes a form of prayer. To remember faithfully is to refuse amnesia. To remember faithfully is to insist that suffering will not disappear simply because society chooses to look away. This is where public theology enters into the conversation. Michelle Alexander gives us a moral vocabulary. Attica gives us historical testimony. Black August, when we consider Jesus' solidarity with the imprisoned, gives us a theological framework through which to interpret both. Together, they invite the church, and indeed all people of conscience, to examine the moral foundations of the carceral state. This is not an argument against law, nor is it an argument against public safety. Rather, it is a challenge to injustice wherever injustice is found. It asks difficult questions about racialized policing, punitive sentencing, the economic exploitation of incarcerated labor, the loss of voting rights, the fragmentation of families and communities. Public critique becomes sacred work whenever it is grounded in the conviction that every human being bears the image of God, even those whom society has forgotten, marginalized, or discarded. Black August theology, in light of Jesus' solidarity with the black political prisoner, reminds us of several enduring truths. If God hears the cries that rise from the prison cells, the church must hear them as well. If God is concerned with breaking chains, then the church must also examine the systems that continue to forge them. And if liberation belongs to the heart of God and God's story, then God's people cannot remain silent about structures that deny human freedom and dignity. One of the most one of the most sobering realities in American history is that some of our most infamous prisons were built directly upon former plantations. This is not merely an architectural detail, it is a moral revelation. In Mississippi, Parchman Prison stands on what was once the Parchman Plantation. The same fields that produced cotton through enslaved labor later produced cotton through incarcerated labor. Those in prison cleared the land, built the prison itself, and continued to work under armed supervision. In Texas, the Imperial Plantation became the Imperial State Prison Farm. More than a century later, the discovery of the remains known as the Sugar Land 95 reminded the nation that the earth has a memory. And that means that long after institutions attempt to bury injustice, the ground itself bears witness. And Louisiana Angola prison occupies the same land that was once several plantations. Even today, incarcerated people labor on soil where enslaved Africans once worked. Scripture teaches us that the land is never morally neutral. After Cain murdered Abel, God declared, "The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." The earth became a witness to violence. It refused to hide what human beings want to forget. The prophets understood this. The prophets understood this also. They imagined the land mourning because of injustice. Creation is seen as suffering when human beings violate God's covenant with one another. The soil does not simply produce crops, it also carries memory. This is why prison landscapes are so unsettling. The fields changed, the legal systems changed, the language changed, but the question remains, what does it mean when the same ground continues to organize black labor under coercion? The Christian faith insists that every person bears the image of God. That image does not disappear behind prison walls. It cannot be erased by a conviction, a sentence, or a prison uniform. If the image of God remains, then every system must be judged by how it treats those who bear that image. Perhaps that is why Jesus chose to identify himself with the imprisoned. I was in prison, and you visited me. He did not speak of prisoners as people outside the reach of God's concern. He located himself among them. If Christ can be found in the prison, then the prison cannot remain outside the church's moral imagination. When we stand before places like Parchman, Sugarland, or Angola, we are confronted with more than history. We are confronted with a question. Have we transformed the nation, or have we merely renamed its institutions? This is not simply a historical question. It is a question every generation of God conscious advocates must answer before God. Attica is not simply an event confined to history, it remains a mirror. It forces us to ask difficult questions about ourselves, about our institutions, about our theology. It reminds us what can happen when human dignity is denied. It reminds us what can happen when people are reduced to problems instead of persons. And it helps us understand why Michelle Alexander's work continues to resonate so powerfully. Black August calls us to remember Attica not only as a tragedy, but as a collective sin against God. It calls us to remember Attica as a testimony that oppressed people will continue to demand dignity, a testimony that truth has a remarkable way of rising even when others try to suppress it, and a testimony that the struggle for liberation remains one of the enduring moral responsibilities of every generation. Let me leave you with this thought. Black August teaches us that memory is resistance. James said, submit yourself therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Resistance becomes sacred when it is able to identify the devils of our world and when it chooses to honor human dignity. And sacred memory always calls us toward public truth telling. This is why Attica still speaks. This is why Michelle Alexander's work still matters. And that is why our engagement with the carceral state is not merely a a political conversation. At its heart, it is a moral and a theological one. Thank you for watching.